America is currently experiencing one of the worst pandemics to reach our borders since the Spanish flu in 1918. Over 100 years later, we find ourselves battling a new pandemic, the novel coronavirus. This disease has not only halted the American economy, but it has disproportionately affected the lives of minority groups in America. The coronavirus has changed life as we know it, halting many services citizens countrywide have grown accustomed to. This shutdown has forced many businesses, including schools, to close their doors for the unforeseen future. This has forced students to make the switch from face to face classes to online classes, changing the scope of their education. It has also forced families to close their doors and limit interactions with loved ones who would regularly visit them. For me personally, the switch hasn't been the easiest. Being stuck at home isn't the part that bothers me most. As a homebody, it's something I'm used to at this point in my life. It's the pressures and stressors that go along with living in one of the most infected cities in America, with a family dynamic completely shifted by the demands of social distancing. As the current situation continues to evolve, there have been alarming developments related to who is affected and the severity of the effects. As it currently stands, African Americans are a demographic who are most negatively impacted by this disease. A CDC study in New York City found the death rate of African Americans at 92.3 per 100,000 persons, compared to a death rate of 45.2 per 100,000 persons for white and Caucasians. With stats this alarming, it's caused families to take extra precautions with how they can interact with loved ones. When discussing why African Americans are more at risk of the disease, there are multiple factors. One factor is the percentage of essential/critical workers that are of a minority background. This means your mechanics, plumbers, gardeners, government workers. Those careers make up 25% of the black and Hispanic workforce compared to 16% of the non-Hispanic white workforce. African Americans currently make up only 12% of all employed workers, but represent a disproportionate 30% of all licensed practical and licensed vocational nurses. That's to say that out of every three nurses fighting this pandemic on the front line is an African American. Work circumstances are a huge part of the infection risk to African Americans, but it isn't the only aspect. Living conditions play a huge role in not only a demographic's risk of infection, but their risk of mortality as well. I currently live in a multi-generational household, meaning I live with my aunt and uncle and my grandma. My uncle is a government worker, aka an essential worker, so he still has to work Monday through Friday and is rarely given an opportunity to work from home, so he must put himself at risk on a daily basis. With mortality rates as high as they are in our community, it's forced him to shift his daily routine and interactions with us. My aunt's job has paid her for the weeks that have passed, but placed her on furlough. She's ran a beauty salon from the backyard and continues to do so, but she also changed her routine with how she interacts with customers. Multi-generational households are commonplace in many minority cultures and makes it easier for the virus to be transmitted to the more vulnerable populations. It also makes it more difficult to isolate anyone who's sick with limited space. With my uncle working as he must and my aunt earning money how she can, they can't help but interact with others on a professional standpoint, which forces them to limit their interaction on a personal standpoint. With four people occupying the house currently, it feels more empty than ever. Family gatherings are a staple in the household. Every Sunday, families come over to enjoy each other's company and share a good meal. The house would be bustling with music and the soul of conversation until around 10 p.m. Every room would occupy at least four people alone. Now we're lucky to find all four of us in a room together. Keeping everyone's safety in mind, my uncle keeps his personal distance from us. A household founded on the basis of coming together is quite literally forced to be apart. Instead of everyone watching movies together, my aunt and uncle watch movies in the garage, keeping their distance from my grandmother, the most vulnerable to this disease, while I spend the majority of my time in my room, and my grandma occupies the living room. With my uncle spending most of his days at work, we begin a new 14-day cycle of self-quarantine practically every day. This forces him to take the extra precaution of avoiding my grandma as if he has the virus, to make sure she's safe. I grew up in Carson, California, in close proximity to a power plant releasing microparticles that degrade lungs and cause asthma. I've had it since I was 4, so I'm also at an extreme risk to COVID 19, which means my uncle has to avoid me as well. Now, I have no problem spending 6 out of 7 days by myself locked in my room playing video games, especially when it ensures my safety and the safety of my loved ones. But ever since the quarantine has started, it's practically turned into all 7 days. Instead of a house bursting with life at least once a week, it's quiet and cold. Instead of hearing the sounds of loved ones laughing and singing karaoke and dancing, I hear only the sound of TVs and dogs barking. The epicenter of warmth and family gathering has been transformed into a desolate isolation ward, vacant of all the ones who filled it with life. Instead of a hug at the door, it's a wave from down the hall as my uncle returns home. As it currently stands, African Americans are the most vulnerable to the current pandemic. They make a vast population of those still employed and actively fighting the coronavirus, but also are the most vulnerable to the effects of the disease. Those employed in these households can't choose to take time off because it isn't just themselves they have to feed. But that also means it isn't just them at risk of catching the disease. It puts us in a lose-lose situation where in order to provide a livelihood for loved ones, we literally have to risk the lives of everyone involved to do so.